Hey, my name's James Mulvaney and welcome to Working Lunch, the show where I speak to a different expert every week to discuss 3 actionable strategies to grow your audience, grow your business, or grow your team. Now, today's session is about to begin, so stay right there and we'll be kicking off today's session very shortly. All right, welcome to Working Lunch. Today, my guest is going to be Sam Sethi, founder of Podcast Festival Events. All right, Sam, how's it going? Welcome to Working Lunch.
Thanks, James. How are you?
Yeah, good. How's it going?
Very well. I'm sat in a radio studio, so apologies. I have more mics around me than I know what to do with, but I haven't got one into my laptop.
I think the fact that you're in a sort of treated soundproof studio makes it sound all right.
Okay, I'll get away with it.
The worst is when someone's in a big, like a huge empty room with a laptop and it's just like, the reverb causes a kind of echo. Okay, so start off then by just introducing yourself. Tell us about what you do and also tell us why you're sat in a radio studio right now.
Okay. I'm a radio presenter on Marlow FM. My show's syndicated around the UK, and I also am a podcaster. And so they're my 2 main gigs. The radio presenting came about by chance, but now I've developed it into a business and technology show that I do every Wednesday. Mm-hmm. So straight after this, I'll be jumping onto a radio show, which is great fun. And yeah, I love just podcasting as well. So they're my 2 main things. And
so if someone wants to listen to you after this, how can they tune in?
So if they want to listen to the radio show, they can ask their Alexa to play Marlow FM, or they can go to the website marlowfm.co.uk and listen live. Yeah. Or conversely, if they want to listen to any of my podcasts, you can go to samtalks.technology and you'll find over 100 different podcasts with some really interesting people.
There's some good interviews on there. I'm curious to know. I was even on there, but I was listening to the guy. I think it was when you interviewed me, the chap before me. It was the founder of was it Friends Reunited, one of those kind of early dating sites? And he had a really interesting story, I thought.
Yeah, he basically set it up by mistake. It was his wife's idea. And then the next thing you know, he sold it and made a fortune, got bored. He was still young, bought it back, a bit like Bebo did, like Michael Birch bought Bebo back. But unlike Michael Birch, he didn't sell it again for the second time. But yeah, he's sort of kicking around, but he's just so happy. He's just investing in companies on the side now.
I think, as well, it was one of those kind of early success stories from when you could kind of start something, on a little bit. It's a bit trickier nowadays, I think, but certainly right place, right time, I think, definitely, and kind of good idea.
You're a lot younger than I am.
Yeah.
And so my generation, it was the first social network. And all of us joined for only one reason, to find out if that girl we fancied in year 7, what she was doing now. And so many affairs started on Friends Reunited. It was ridiculous.
Didn't it have a curse? Wasn't it like the curse of Friends Reunited or something?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so how did you get firstly involved in radio? What was sort of sparked your interest of broadcasting?
A friend of mine on the radio station said, "You fancy doing an 80s show?" And I'd never done radio. I'd done DJing before. And I thought, I'm the first person to say, look, try things that are new, always change, always play with something different. Yep. And so I got into it, and after I'd played Shalimar for about the 10th time, I really was bored. I mean, the 80s is a great era, but then I did the 90s and whatever. But you get bored after a while, and I sound like Alan Partridge after about 10 minutes doing music radio. It's not my genre, but I always wanted to do a business and technology show. There are so many brilliant entrepreneurs, both here in the UK, Europe, and obviously across the pond. And they've all got a great story. So I just wanted to tell that story. And that's where the business and technology show started.
And before we sort of get into today's discussion, the last sort of question I want to ask you is, what do you think it is about radio that people love, and why is it sort of still prominent as ever?
Yeah, I mean, the big debate right now is podcasting versus radio. Radio has to be live and interactive. If you're not live and interactive, then you might as well do a podcast, because being live, it's really funny. Being live with you right now, it gives you that extra adrenaline rush. You're on the edge. We can't do a take 2. We can't do whatever. But on a podcast, it's like, oh, stop. I'll edit that later. I'll do something with it. So live radio gives you that real lovely adrenaline rush. And I wouldn't miss it for the world.
And I think that's sort of why it speaks to so many people, quite literally. But that's the excitement, isn't it? It's that you've got someone who's sat there on the other end of the line. And I think during lockdown, that's was so important to lots of people.
Yeah.
We saw huge spikes in listener levels across the board on radio.co, and it's really interesting because I think your podcast listening kind of stayed around the same. It didn't really spike, but radio, my goodness, we saw a huge hike. Like, it's just, I think it's because there's that human connection. You've got someone, like you say, it's live. They're right there with you almost.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's dive into today's topic. We're going to be talking all about podcasting. Firstly, basically how to sort of formulate and produce a podcast, then how to promote it, and then talking about sort of how to start monetizing it and sponsorship and advertising. So let's kick things off.
Okay. So what would you like me to start? How I produce them?
Yeah. Let's talk about if someone's thinking about starting a podcast, what are your recommendations for starting out?
Find a passion. Find your passion first. Don't do a podcast just because everyone else is doing a podcast, because everyone else is doing a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's over 1 million podcasts out there now. So you are going to be the 1,000,001th. And if you're going to just do it because you feel you have to, you'll get bored by episode 7, or even sooner. I think most people think podcasting is just stick a mic, have a little chat, and the world will knock on your door. And it doesn't work that way. More often than not, you'll find that you end up talking to nobody in the first several podcasts, and you have to get your mates to start talking about it. And it's hard, and we'll come on to it. But editing also, I spend more time editing and distributing and promoting my podcast than I do recording it. And people don't, when they first start out, understand that that's where you spend your time.
Do you think that's a good formula then, to think about, is there sort of like a set proportion of how much time you think someone should spend promoting versus editing versus actually recording?
3 to 1 is my ratio. I spend a lot of time editing, because when I have guests, it's really weird. I've learned to pick up people's social tics. Most people don't realize they've got a voice tick. Right. He said, got it, it's awful on a podcast when you listen back to it, but people don't realize that they've got that social tick. And when you edit back, you have to cut those out. You have to cut out the big gaps between. And most people, when they're talking, it's not that they mean to do or it's their brain, because it's live. They're going, what shall I say next? What's the next thing I've got to say? And that to me really is where I think I spend most of my time. So I'm erring here.
Do you think it's worth people spending time editing that out then?
I do.
Because there's different trains of thought on that. Some people say it doesn't matter. It sounds more conversational. If someone's excessively nervous and they're perhaps hesitating all the time, and you do sometimes speak to people like that who, if it's the first time doing, and I just said, then, which is one of those things, it's the first time recording a podcast and they're really not sure what to say. And yes, they might sort of hesitate, or they might kind of go, oh, can I start that bit again, or whatever. But is that really necessary fair enough, you need to take those real kind of hiccups out, but every single do you think you should spend time taking it out? Because that's a lot of time investment, isn't it? It takes a long time to get that right.
I think if you're using older tools like Audacity, I wouldn't do it. But we'll come onto something like Descript, which just makes it a one click to remove. So that's why I do it. For example, a lot of people do there's or double words in their conversation. I never realized people did it, but they go the point of the and it's like, and when you listen back to an edited podcast and it's cleaned up, the person sounds more intelligent. I don't mean you sound unintelligent because you do it, but I've got permission from you, and I only have permission from you to be in your ears because I'm going to deliver a podcast that gives you value. If I'm wasting your time with a puffed out podcast that is fat and bloated, I think it's disrespectful. You've given me permission. Let me make it the best experience I can for you. Keep it concise.
And also, when you're talking about editing, how long do you record for, and do you try and have a sort of set time limit that you stick to, or?
No, I mean, I everyone, I've listened to your show as well, and there's many other experts better than me who've said, 25 minutes. It's the commute to work. It's the dog walk. It's whatever. I go with the theory that it's only as good as it's interesting. So if it's 25 minutes, great. that's 25 minutes. I interviewed Charles Cadbury the other day. We were talking about his new Alexa skill. That was a 25-minute podcast. It was brilliant. Didn't need to waffle. That was tight. I listened to somebody else the other day who I was recording, and that went on for an hour 15 actually. And it was all good stuff still. So no, I don't have a length.
Right. Okay. But then do you try and sort of always reduce the amount of time someone speaks for and just try and take out the juicy bits then? Is that your kind of approach to editing?
Yeah, I mean, I will always try and make the guest feel comfortable. So, if it was you on my show, I'd say, hey, James, where are you in the world today? How's COVID? You're getting comfortable with me and I'm getting comfortable with you. But my listener doesn't need to know that part of the conversation.
Yeah.
So I'll edit that out. Again, the person might start talking about something that isn't related to the topic that we're on, but it's fun for me and him to talk about, or she. But that isn't something I'd leave in.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about sort of when you sort of open a recording up with a guest? Do you normally press that record button the second that you get on? Because you mentioned, yes, okay, you'll edit out the sort of the niceties, the introduction. Sometimes people say that some of the conversation on the pre-show chat sometimes can end up being more interesting than stuff that you talk about during the show. And I've had this myself, either where I've been on the guest side of the seat, where I've sort of started telling someone a story and thought, actually, this is probably quite good for the actual recording itself, and they've not been recording, so I'll then think, right, let's get that in. Or also on the interviewer side, where I've been sat there interviewing someone, and actually some of the stuff that the person says before you hit the record button can be more revealing and more interesting than the kind of, I suppose a lot of people have a kind of a set list of things that they want to discuss, or the kind of their spiel that they talk about time and time again, so to speak. So what do you think about that?
I don't do that.
Yeah.
Partly because I think it's a little unfair on the guest, because I like to say, right, we are now recording.
Yeah.
Maybe that's because of being a blogger and a journalist before. I like to have a private moment where they can say anything they like. So I've had people reveal, I had a famous Sky TV presenter who revealed to me that she was now a lesbian.
Yeah.
Didn't even ask her the question, but she decided that she'd reveal that to me. And I was like, damn, I wish she could say that in the podcast. But actually, she didn't want to.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Fine.
Yeah. So you think sort of start off, if you're just sort of templating this, have a 5-minute chat with someone, then be clear about when you're hitting that record button, and off you go. And then sort of to get on to, you mentioned Descript before. I'm kind of keen to talk about this because I think this is a really interesting tool. We've been using it a little bit for some client work. For people who are watching who aren't aware, what is Descript and how has it helped you with your editing?
So Descript's a podcasting studio. I record most of my interviews over Zoom because of COVID currently, but you can record directly into Descript. But the power of Descript is it uses the ability to auto-transcribe the whole podcast. And then like a Word document, I can just cross out bits, I can cut and paste bits, I can remove, as I said, all the ums, the ahs, the likes, you knows, the double words in one click, so they all go. Normally I find it's like 100+ double words or whatever. So I've tightened that up and it's not taking me time. But what's really amazing is as I edit the transcription, it's automatically editing the audio for me at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'm not guessing in the WAV file where did James say that word, or how do I get that? And what's really nice is then also, because of the transcription being labeled, it automatically detects the speakers as well. I can cut out a clip. So you might have said something really amazing. I can cut that clip out, put it to the side, and then that becomes my audiogram to promote that podcast later. And so it's really powerful in its ability to allow me to edit the podcast visually, just like I would a Word document. And then when I publish or export it, the normalization that it does is unbelievably good. I once decided, I can't remember why, so I used to spend hours in Audacity or in Adobe Audition, getting the normalization, the sound levels right. And it was, I'd never get it right. I wasn't good enough, I wasn't an engineer, studio engineer. So I was lucky. I was, as I said, I call it editing in the dark. I was just guessing where it was. And Descript, actually, I uploaded a edited version of Descript back into Audacity, and the line was perfect for both volume tracks. It was just perfect, and I knew the levels were right. So it just simplifies my life. And I'm a real advocate of Descript as a product. I think the other thing I'd say is that the CEO of Descript is Andrew Mason. He's the ex-CEO of Groupon.
Okay, I didn't know that actually.
Yeah.
Interesting.
And
Yeah.
the other thing is the company who invested into them, you often think who invested is Andreessen Horowitz, and you know that they never go for a donkey.
Absolutely. They did a really interesting article on the sort of podcasting space, didn't they, as well? I think last year or the year before. So, I think one of the good things about Descript as well is it's a great example of how AI is kind of powering, like, transcription's really good on eScript, but also that you can actually correct your own voice. So you can kind of start sort of filling in the blanks if you miss a word out, or if you want to correct a sentence. It actually uses AI to create like a computer generated version of your voice, which is, to me, is like remarkable.
Yeah, it's called
Futuristic stuff. Yeah,
it's called Overdub, and I was on the beta, and I'd spent half an hour training my voice, and then I recorded something, and I asked my wife to come in and tell me what was the real me and what was the overdub. She got it bloody wrong. I couldn't believe it. She got me. 26 years we've been together, and she couldn't tell my voice from a computer. Don't know what that says.
Do you use that feature much?
Sadly, I don't. I mean, I've tried. I mean, I think it's one of those amazing magic moments when you see it happen, and then I try and work out when I'm going to use it, and I haven't yet really had a real. I've started to wonder whether I do jingles with it, because they've added a whole load of computer-generated professional voices to Overdub. So now what you can do is you can type out your jingle and then choose one of the computer-generated voices that doesn't sound computer-generated, and you can make your jingle and you put your music bed in, and suddenly you've got your own jingle within about 10 minutes.
So you could use that for sort of introducing yourself or introducing a guest. There's lots of creative ways you could use that.
Yeah.
I wonder how it copes with like complicated names and things, because this is the thing with these AI voices. They don't always get it right. Even when you're on Google Maps, navigating around, it occasionally throws in a street name and you're like, what? or just the way it pronounces certain roads and things. It just, so I think the thing is that the AI voices are kind of, my opinion on them anyways, like they're good. They're much better than they were like 10, 15 years ago. Still not quite there yet though.
No, and I'd say with Descript, you're probably at 95, 96% accurate. It doesn't recognize quite a few odd things. So if you've got a company name, it probably won't recognize it properly. And you can go, and then the nice thing about it is you can literally, like a Word document, go back and just type over the transcription, and it'll just, it won't destroy the audio. And it's brilliant in that sense.
Okay, cool. So next up is, let's just talk about distributing and kind of marketing a podcast. This is a question that's, on loads of people's minds, and certainly when you first start out, it's intimidating. It's like, how do I get listeners? How do I actually get people tuning in and listening to what I have to say? Because especially now, there's so much competition. Everyone's starting podcasts, as you mentioned before. I think to begin with, the first thing, we always advise clients to do, and I always talk about, is just like making sure you've actually got quality products, making sure it's something that's interesting for people to listen to, or entertaining, whatever angle you're going off. But how do you then go and kind of get it out to the masses?
So, as I said, I spend more time distributing and promoting my podcast than I do probably creating and editing. And that's because there's no point doing it if no one's listening to it. You might as well stop there and then. I started off using a product called Headliner, and Headliner is a great little app. I'd upload my MP3 from Descript. I'd add a little, like an album cover to it, in effect, a little image up front. I'd put some moving animated voice thing that over it. And why was that? Because we're all meerkats. We're all going through our streams, and the minute there's a GIF or there's an animated just sound wave, ooh, what was that? Let me stop and have a look. And that's the sole reason I do it. There is no value other than it's a moving object. But what that allowed me to do was to create a 2-minute. So most people know, and if they don't, let me just explain. So you've got unlimited upload into Facebook. So if I wanted to take an hour's podcast and throw it into Facebook, I could. I don't, but I could. I've got 10 minutes roughly on LinkedIn for my podcast, and I've got 2 minutes, 20 seconds on Twitter. And that's all you can upload. So I make sure I take those clips from Descript at 2 minutes sections, and I go, right, James has said something really clever there, put that aside, cut and paste that part, cut and paste that part. And then I upload those as audiograms into social media. Now, that's how I used to do it. And that was step one to me learning how to distribute and try and gain an audience. but I found a product that I really love, a bit like I love
Yep.
eScript, and it's called Lately.ai, and it's an amazing product.
Okay, and what does Lately do then? How's it different to creating audiograms or?
So very much similar to what you said, AI is becoming much more helpful.
Yeah.
It's gone off it sounds glossy when you say AI to actually doing something useful. So what Lately does, it takes your video, podcast, or blog, and it allows you to put it into their system. And then what it does, it creates 20 or 30 tweetable, audioable, videoable, if that's even a bloody word, and allows it creates those 30 things. So it transcribes your podcast, for example. Let's stick with podcasting. Allows you to then see those 30, and the AI and the algorithm is working out what it thinks is interesting within the podcast. Now, how it does that, I don't know. That's a bit more black box, but the results are really good. And
Right.
what it does is it takes those 30, and then a bit like Hootsuite, you can then, well, first of all, before you do that part, you can then go back and manually edit if you really want to. But what it's done is it's taken the words and attached the audio to it, and then you can literally hit that and tweet that out. But what's nice about it, it also adds a calendar function. So now I can set in a day, I can say, right, do every 2 hours, send out one of these 30 tweets. And I can then say, send it out to Twitter, LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, wherever I want it to go, any of my social media endpoints. And so suddenly I've saved a bucket load of time from having to manually find that interesting bit within my podcast to letting the AI take out based on, NLP results, search results, everything they know. And that's brilliant because now I've got something that I can use. Now I don't have to send all the 30 out. I might choose only 5 of those.
Do you find that some are really effective, and some are actually not very good? Does it kind of not always get it right? Some are a bit kind of, confusing or whatever.
Yeah, and that's fine, but that's the human element I can apply to the last part. And so what I think of lately is it's more about unlocking the value of my podcast. So look, you asked me earlier, how long's a podcast? And how long's a piece of string? 25 minutes to an hour and a half. An hour and a half podcast, maybe people aren't going to listen to it all. So I need to find a way of finding those chunks of gold that are in the podcast that you've talked about, so that somebody might, we might start off with talking about radio.co, and then we talked about podcast.co. Then you told me about your Manchester, previous radio show that you did, and then you told me something else you're doing. And suddenly, but all of that might not be applicable to the listener, but they might love to know more about Matchmaker. So that tweet that goes out about Matchmaker would be the one that drags them back to listen to that podcast. And they only want to come to that section. So how can I do that? When Lately really helps me do that.
Great. And the web address is lately.ai, isn't it?
It is, yes.
Just quickly before we kind of move on to the next topic, if anyone has any questions for Sam or myself, please put them in the comments. We'll happily take some bit of a Q&A at the end. I've seen we've already got a few in, which is great. So we'll be coming on to those in a bit. But if anyone's got any questions based on what we've talked about or anything really to do with podcasting or radio, it'd be great to sort of have a little bit of an open discussion at the end. Okay, so lately, it's obviously a massive time saver. I think the real value of that tool is the fact that you've got, you've not only got the sort of AI sort of generation of these assets built in, but it's like you say, social media management side. Because normally to do this, you could either do it yourself using a tool like Headliner, or you could hire a videographer to create these assets for you, or sort of social marketing manager. But then you've actually got to schedule those stuff. So there's kind of a clear time saving, the fact that you kind of immediately just put in these assets into one platform. You're not having to sort of download them, export them, re-import them, all this kind of thing, because it does take a lot of time. It's easy to miss things as well, I think.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, what's nice about it is you can also measure, because it's got great analytics, which ones worked, when did it work, what time was the best tweet that went out. So then you can tweak when you send yours out again. And so you're not just, I guess, shooting in the dark, which is what I think you do when we manually edit podcasts and try and clip bits that we think are interesting. We're not really getting any measurable value back. We're just hoping that we hit the right tweet at the right time for the right people. With Lately, what I find is that you actually get a tangible record of what worked and what didn't, and then you can just tweak your own personal output.
Okay, great. And then, so sort of moving on to the final topic, which is monetization. And this is something, again, I think a lot of people will think, I want to start a podcast because it's an easy way of making money, or because I'm going to become rich, or they see Joe Rogan, interviewing huge celebrities and think, it's going to blow up overnight. Of course, there's a lot more to it than that. What's your advice in terms of how to actually start turning a podcast into a business?
First and foremost, I think you have to do a volume of podcasts. You have to get the podcasting right.
Mm-hmm.
You have to build your audience. It's like anything. A sponsor or an advertiser will only come to you if they think you've got a credible audience in a vertical that they want to be involved in.
Right.
So don't expect day one. You might be lucky. You might, know the chairman of a company who's got loads of spare cash and wants to throw it your way. But the reality is most likely people are going to say, no, show me your track record. Show me that this is going to be around for a while. I don't like podcasts. And I'll mention one, for example, and I love the podcast, Leo Laporte's Twit, I think is a great platform. If anyone's not listened to it, it's slightly high level in terms of, it doesn't go deep on anything, but it just covers the general tech news. But I don't get the idea of putting Casper mattresses as an advert, or talking about selling Chipotle whatevers.
Yeah.
That's such a I'm going to fast forward through it as on a podcast. The advertiser should know that. There's probably very little measurement between the audience and the advertiser. I actually prefer, and I have done, is to get sponsors for my podcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And that to me is a much more credible thing. So at the beginning of my podcast, I'll say, this podcast is brought to you by X, Y, or Z.
Yes.
And then I've got a clean podcast. And then at the end, I can thank the sponsor again and then have a call to action for them. And that means I'm not in the middle of the podcast going, oh, sorry, James, time for an advert. I've got to tell you something about it. Sorry, James, go on.
So it's a bit, just to say, clarify there. So it's really about making sure not only you're reaching out to companies who might be of interest to your audience, but they're actually actively willing to then sort of spend some money promoting themselves on your podcast. But it's just about finding that match. It's about knowing your audience and having been really clued up on exactly who's listening to your show in the first place. That's the kind of the first starting point, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you've got to look at your own analytics. I mean, Podcast.co do great analytics, and so you look at your analytics. Where's your audience coming from? How long are they? Podcasters won't tell you this stat because they're too embarrassed most of the time. How long did anyone actually listen to your radio show, your podcast? Did they listen to the whole 90 minutes or 27 minutes or whatever it is? Did they drop off halfway through? But you've got to be honest with yourself about where your podcast adds value, and then you've got to go back to sponsors who you think are going to be relevant to your audience, and vice versa, and your audience is relevant to the sponsor. And then fundamentally, I believe, just ask. So many people just don't ask. That's a
good point. What's the best strategy for asking and finding sponsors?
Connect with them on LinkedIn, find about them, talk to them, explain what your podcast is and what the value would be for them. Don't try and just say, can I have a load of money? You might start off with a barter deal. I started when I first got sponsors asking for no money. I said to them, look, I love your product. I've been using it. I want to endorse it. I've got a great audience. I understand that, money's tight. So look, you give me a free use for a year of your product and I'll endorse you for a year. And then in the second year, we'll talk about the value that I've added, and maybe then you'll start to pay me, or 6 months down the road, whatever the time frame is. And I think you can always go in with a barter deal to begin with first. Try and find, a non-monetary way of doing it. And then when you've proved that you actually generate value back to that sponsor, then you've got a strong card to say, well, look, now's the time to dip into your pocket and give me a little bit of cash.
I think that's a really interesting, good idea, and also the fact that potentially you could even get the sponsor to help you with promoting your show. Once they're sponsoring it, even if it's just a barter deal, they're much more likely to say, oh, listen to the latest episode, and if you can kind of get that built into your podcast from the get-go, that can only be a good thing, right?
Yeah, and the companies I work with, I only work with companies I actually use products for, and I will endorse naturally. As I said, I wouldn't want to go and get Casper mattresses just because I wouldn't want to use them. Not because they're bad or good, by the way, just because I just don't know anything about them, right? And I'm just sitting there selling something for the sake of it. So I just don't think it works. Now, the the other side of this is companies like Spotify and others are now beginning to inject ads into podcasts. And again, I'm not sure I think that's a good way forward for the industry.
It seems with Spotify, I think that they're trying to push the podcasting side of things because, obviously they're not paying any royalties to those podcasters as they would pay royalties to recording artists, which, and it feels a little bit unfair that they're running ads, certainly because obviously if you're not paying for Spotify, if you have a free account, you get ads served between songs or, like you say, between podcasts or even in the middle of a podcast. But the actual producer of that podcast isn't seeing any of that revenue, which doesn't feel fair to me, not entirely anyway.
No, I think there needs to be a better ad revenue share back to podcasts. But then again, the micro payments are going to become very difficult to make. I mean, how are you going to transfer? I think it's, many sites go £25 or £30 before you get it. And well, how are you going to know when you've got that?
What do you think about subscription model in terms of, there's lots of podcasts that are on Patreon, for example. Some of them have like tens of thousands of subscribers. Some might have like a few hundred, but even if you can get like a few hundred subscribers, you've got enough really to run it as a business. If you've got, say, I don't know, 500 people paying $5 a month, so suddenly you've got $2,500 a month coming in. That's a decent living, to or at least kind of allow you to focus on it more and more.
I think we've got a problem in the West where people aren't used to paying for content. But I think the model's changing right now. I think you're beginning to see people say, okay, yes, I'll pay for the FT behind the paywall. I'll pay for Medium because I want those extra articles. I personally would pay for a Facebook, Twitter that was a subscription model if it got rid of all the trolls and the hangers on. And yes, I think there is a model for paying for podcasting, but I just don't think it's in the West. If you look at the Far East, like Japan or China, Himalaya is a podcasting host. And if you put your podcast up on there, the first thing it does is it's very front and center. How much would you like to charge for someone to listen to your podcast? Nothing is free. You set your own price and then people pay. And I think the number one podcast on Himalaya has had 1.7 billion downloads. It's ridiculous.
That's crazy, isn't it?
And it's all paid for.
And how about other sort of monetization types? Have you ever sold anything, courses or events or merchandise?
Events is a great way. So during COVID, me and two friends, we put on the podcast festival. We got some speakers and we charged for the event, and that worked very well. I think that selling merchandise, again, I don't think I'm far enough down the road with where I want to be. So I'm on around 6,000 or 7,000 downloads per episode. I'd like to get to around 10,000 downloads an episode. And at that point, I feel I've got a strong audience that maybe then I can look at other monetization strategies. But right now, I think I'd be spending money on content and on materials and product and just have a warehouse full of Sam Talks technology mugs that no one wants.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I think with merchandise, like my perspective on it is try and again make something that people want. Like think about little like catchphrases, So it might be that you're putting quotes of someone, from back in. If you got like a podcast talking about 60s classic rock or something, you might put some quotes from famous recording artists or something like that on there, just to make it kind of more interesting. But I think merchandise, like I said, you say certainly once you start building an audience, if you create stuff that people want to wear or want to have on their desk, and also be creative with it, think about things like phone cases. It doesn't just have to be a t-shirt or mug. It can be potentially good. There's lots of services out there now which, make it easy to print on demand as well. So you don't have to carry stock. I think it's something that's, I've seen work pretty well for certain podcasts. But again, I think that maybe works better when you're talking about, sort of almost like an entertainment style podcast. So if it's like something on, type of music, or if it's on kind of, there's a lot of murder mystery type podcasts, those sort of things, true crime. That's the word I'm looking for.
Yep.
That probably works. Maybe not for business and technology, but who knows?
So one of the things I have done is taken on a PR agent.
Okay.
And I think PR and blogging is going to get much stronger in the next couple of years. So when I was on the corporate side of life, running a corporate business, and we had a PR agency in those days, I was always looking for outlets. So you'd always go to the top magazines. Then it became the top bloggers. And I think we will eventually see PR companies reaching out more and more to get their CEOs as guests on on podcasts, get their snippet of content into a podcast. So they're going to be hunting for podcasts, I think, which are aligned to their business. Because I think more and more people, if you look at our attention span, where do you spend your time? Do you spend your time listening to the radio, listen to audiobooks, podcasts, or do you spend your time reading? And I think more and more people are saying, actually, with a podcast, I can be out at the gym, on my bike, in the car. I can do all sorts of other things. I'm not tied to my desk. And that's where I think video doesn't play so well for me. I think video means I have to focus on you much more.
Yes, I agree.
So I think podcasters should, A, try and find their own PR person if they think they've got to that level. And B, I think try and make their podcast aware to PR agencies. If they don't know you exist, there's no way they're going to then try and put stuff your way. And I think eventually, PR agencies, because those guests could become your future sponsors.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you say, if you can kind of interview people who have got substantial followings because they, high power CEOs or sports people or whatever it might be, it's only a good thing because, not only does it make really interesting content, but, they have that audience, they have that sort of spread that they can push your podcast to once they've appeared on it. So I think getting the right guests on and also being a guest on other people's podcasts is great as well, I think.
And I always ask my guests one favor.
Yeah.
So after I've interviewed them and we've turned off the mics, I always ask them just one favor. Could they recommend one friend in their network who would be my next guest? And often they will pick a good person for you. And so it takes a lot of the pressure off you finding your next guests.
Mm-hmm. And if they introduce you directly, even better.
Exactly.
Yeah, because it comes with that. It's almost like that recommendation, isn't it? Okay. If anyone has got any questions for Sam or myself, please put them in the comments. And I think we're probably at question time now. I know you've got to get off for 2. So let's kick off with Russell Hope has asked, most people listen to a podcast are auditory aligned. If we're auditory aligned, are we more accepting of nuances?
I think what he's saying is, I think he's disagreeing with me about taking ums and ahs, likes, and your nose out, and that's just taste. I think that's just taste. If I sit here and go, it's really annoying for me. I just don't like it, and I just prefer, because I can do it quickly and easily, and it's not a chore, just to take them out. That's it.
Okay, and what are your thoughts on using audiograms? Which we kind of discussed already, but
yeah, I think you have to do it. So RSS, what still has, but no one uses it. Used to have pingbacks and trackbacks. I don't know if you remember those. Mm-hmm. And it was a great way. So if you had a pingback, it was like somebody's made a comment on their site and about your blog, and trackbacks were going the other way. And I still would love somebody like Descript or Lately as an example. So I'd love to be able to comment within my transcript and then take that comment and make that a tweetable item, so that when my podcast goes out, there's a little button, a comment button in the audio, and somebody goes, at James Mulvaney, I talked about you at 30 minutes 22 seconds.
Yeah,
guaranteed you're going to come and find out what I said about you. And I think
I agree. Yeah, it's like SoundCloud have a similar thing where you can comment at certain points of the track. Yeah,
and I'd love that to happen more generally.
It needs to be, what there needs to be is a standard, really. It's like if you could build that into the standard where you can kind of open it up to platforms, because that's the thing. I think it's all very well just having like an enclosed environment like SoundCloud where you can comment on bits of the track, although SoundCloud is kind of more for music, isn't it? And again, I'm not sure if SoundCloud has the traction now that it once had, but certainly like it was a really good way of actually being able to comment on a waveform,
Vimeo has added in support for chapters, and and there's a few others doing it. But again, not all platforms. Spotify doesn't recognize chapters. Apple does recognize chapters. Nobody recognizes pingbacks and trackbacks that I'm aware of. But audiograms, as I said earlier, you've got to unlock the value, whether you do it manually or you do it automatically through products like Lately. I think you've got to do that because no one's going to give you an hour and a half of their time just on the hope that it was an interesting podcast.
Cool. This is from Sal. How do you find a good PR agency? I'm always getting pitched at guests that don't fit the format.
Good question. I happen to know a couple of friends who are PR people, and what I do is I go out and I tell them what I want to deliver as my objectives, and then I ask them to send a brief back. If I get a waffly, we will help you randomly do something. I want some tangible examples of where they've done stuff, and I want to set them clear objectives. So I don't pay for a retainer. I'm not one of these people who says, I'll give you 1,000 or 3,000 or whatever silly amount of money per month, and just on the hope that you might get me some noise. I do it on a deliverable. So I want you to either get me on someone else's podcast. I want you to get me. So one of my objectives for me was to get onto radio lists. That's the one thing that I think podcasters can do really well at. Radio lists exist. Producers have people that they turn to, and I want to be one of those people that they turn to. So there's a story about Facebook breaking, and Radio 5 Live wants to get somebody on the show to talk about it. I want to be that person. I'm not, but I want to be. Now, that's one of my objectives. Tell me how many radio stations that are of relevance you're going to get me onto. Tell me how many other podcasts you're going to get me into. Tell me other ways that you think you can help me promote my brand.
Is it worth trying to find sort of in that respect then, trying to find a PR company that has got specific expertise in the radio industry, or, because the thing is, I think from my experience with a lot of PR companies is like they'll have a go-to list of journalists that they will reach out to. And a case of a lot of the time is they work as in, I've got a press release as a business, and they'll distribute that out and they'll sort of get me various articles on, generally speaking, it's like trade news websites. And to be honest, whenever I've tried them personally, the results have not been hugely impressive. But I think that sounds really exciting. What you've just mentioned is, the idea is if you could become the go-to guy to give an opinion on a topic, either on radio or even TV. There's a guy here in Manchester called Dan Sodergren, and he has, for some reason, he is the guy. He has been the go-to guy for like BBC Breakfast. Like whenever they need to get someone in to talk about technology, he's like the one they come to, and it's been fantastic for his personal brand.
Well, the radio shows that I go on to other radio shows and do. It's because the producer just has me as their favorite person now to go to on a trusted source. They know that when I get on the mic, I'm not going to be going, oh yeah, sorry, don't know about that. They know they're going to get something interesting. It's quick and it's 30 seconds or whatever it may be. And you just have to build it up. But what I'm trying to do with a PR agent is leverage their knowledge of the industry, and open their doors for me, and then fundamentally become a trusted source. And then that builds my brand, and hopefully some of their listeners might come and listen to my podcast. So that's how I try and grow my audience that way.
Okay, great. And I think we've got time for kind of like one final question. This is good. This is from Patrick. What do you think brings more awareness? Live interviews like the one you're on now, or podcasts?
Interesting. I think the live interviews, this comes back to radio versus podcasting, right? Live versus on demand. And I think, unfortunately, I'm going to go with on demand, not because I'm against live. I'm about to do a live radio show in a minute. But what I think is we are all time deficient, and we want to listen to what we want to listen to at a time when we can. This is brilliant. This is, I listen every week as a guest, as you know, and that fits in with me having a cup of tea, bits of lunch, and whatever, and it works perfectly. But if this was at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, I couldn't, right? So I would listen on demand. And I think the only thing I will say to anybody who's producing a podcast is be consistent and persistent. If you deliver your podcast every Friday at 3 o'clock, make sure it's delivered at Friday at 3 o'clock. Don't miss that window. If your podcast is Monday, make sure it's Monday, because too often it's like, oh, I'll do it tomorrow. I'll do it on Tuesday. Well, that listener of yours, their habit is to listen to you at Monday at 2 o'clock while walking the dog. If you're not there in their podcast list ready to be listened to, they'll find another podcast, and guess what? They probably won't come back to you. So that, I would say, is persistent and consistent with your podcast. And live versus on demand, Yeah, I'm leaning more towards on demand just because people's habits are to listen when they want.
Yeah, I mean, the benefit, just to add to that, I think if you can do both, it's great. It's just another way of engaging. I think one of the benefits of doing live is that you could take questions and you can be reactive to the audience, and people feel like, they're going to get to know you a bit better, perhaps. But you can still do that on demand. But I think, of course, if anyone's just tuned in now, perhaps they've just sort of tuned in towards the end of it. Of course, as soon as the second we finish, this is available to watch again on demand, across a plethora of different channels, Facebook, YouTube, etc. So, there's, I think if you can try and do both, it can be great. And I think doing a live show can be a great complement to a podcast.
Yes.
It's just, but again, it's not live is not right for everyone. Like you mentioned earlier, some people are intimidated by it. There's no room for error. And, you've got to try and make sure that everything runs kind of on time and according to sort of the plan, which doesn't always happen when you're recording, like,
Exactly.
All right, Sam. And as I've said, just sort of making sure we've kind of recording everything on time. We're out of time, and I know you have to go off and do a radio show in 15 minutes, so I don't want to keep you any longer. So for those of you, for people watching who want to find out more about you, how can they get in touch, and how can they find out more about your event also?
So yeah, please just come to samtalks.technology. You'll find all the ways of subscribing or finding how to get hold of me. I'm very open. If somebody wants to be a guest, let me know. We'll have a chat. And the next event I'm doing is called Mashup, and we've got Charlie Cadbury talking about an amazing technology, which is interactive radio ads linked to your Alexa skill with frictionless commerce. So it's fascinating what he's built, and that's going out on the 22nd of October. So it's called mashup.events. Come and have a look at it and join us live on that one.
Excellent. All right, that's Sam. Thanks very much for your time today.